Hey, Mama. So we are in quarter 4, which means that all of us are either mapping out our 2024 or have already mapped it out. And one thing I know that many people are starting to think about is, huh, is it time to add a podcast to my business? Should I start a podcast for my business? And so that is what we're talking about today. Really just diving into when it would actually make sense for you to start a podcast for your business and really looking at it from the angle of being a mom and a business owner. So let's jump into today's episode. Hey, Mama. Welcome to the Mama Turned Mompreneur podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Singletary, a wife, mama of 2, and former virtual assistant turned podcast strategist and producer. This is the podcast for the mama who is burnt out trying to build her business on social media. You're tired of putting in so much time and energy marketing your business on social media, only to hear crickets and barely get any engagement on your posts. You don't have time to waste as a busy mama, and you need an effective way to generate leads for your business. Well, Mama, you're in the right place. On this podcast, I will be giving you the inside scoop on how to create a podcast that generates consistent leads for your business on autopilot, mixed in with some mompreneur hacks and tips for growing your business as a busy mama. So grab your coffee, your notebook and pen, put in those earbuds, and let's dive in. So one thing I often see happens when people are either thinking about starting a podcast or they go ahead and jump right in and do it is, one, the people who are thinking about it, they tend to get overwhelmed just like researching and figuring out the best way to do it. And do they need to have all these things checked off before it would actually make sense for them to start a podcast? And then you have those people who they get excited, they jump in and do it, but then they become a pod fade, meaning that they don't even make it past 10 episodes. And so there are some things that you do want to have in place, that you do want to have, in a sense, checked off before you start a podcast. So we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, there are a couple of things that I kind of want to debunk or clarify and help change your mindset around when it comes to, when is the best time to actually add a podcast to your business. Now, back in episode 49, I did an episode where I talk about the signs it's time to add a podcast to your business. So you can go back and listen to that one. I'm not, talking about those things again. I'm actually diving a little bit more into really looking at what stage of business you're in, so see if it would make sense for you to start a podcast. But let's get into the things that you don't actually need to do or need to have before you start a podcast for your business. So you don't need to have a large audience. That is not a requirement to start a podcast. So way back in episode 9, I dive into this and explain why you don't need a large audience to start a podcast. But just to kind of give a brief overview, you can actually use your podcast to grow your audience. So leveraging things like podcast SEO, you're able to get in front of more of your ideal clients with your podcast, and you can grow your audience that way. And this is a strategy I've actually used to grow my audience. I have been able to, through my podcast, get more people on my email list, get more people following me on Instagram, building my community that way. And it's been through my podcast. So your podcast can be an effective part of growing your audience and building that community aspect of your business. The other thing you don't need is you don't need to have hit 6 figures in order to start a podcast. there's no monetary requirement in order for you to start a podcast. And I know a big part of this is, thinking you have to be well established, that you have to have, a full team. And you don't. I'm going to be transparent with you guys. I have not hit six figures in my business. I'm striving towards that, but I haven't hit that yet. I just hired a VA for my business this month. So, and now I'm coming up on a year of podcasting. And I just share that to say, it's not a requirement. Despite me not having hit six figures or, not having a full team, I've really been able to use my podcast as an effective part of my marketing strategy. I've signed clients through my podcast and everything. I've really been able to build my authority and be seen as an expert in my niche through my podcast. So you don't have to have hit all of these things before it makes sense for you to add a podcast to your business. Now let's talk about, adding a podcast as a mom and a business owner. One thing I see a lot of mompreneurs, mom business owners, whatever you want to call yourself, I see them say, when it comes to thinking about starting a podcast, they say that, adding another piece of content when content creation already takes up a lot of time, it just doesn't make sense to them. And I get it, the thought of starting a podcast can feel like another thing on your plate. And so I want you to shift your mindset around this. When it comes to adding a podcast to your business, you actually can simplify your content creation. Now, I talk about this a lot back in episode 58, where I share about why podcasting is the best marketing strategy for mom business owners. But again, just to give you an overview, when you are taking a large piece of content like a podcast and repurposing it for other platforms you're on, it simplifies the content creation because you're not coming up with a bunch of new topics. So thinking about, different social media posts, you may be trying to come up with a new post every day. Well, you can literally take your podcast, chop it up, and make a week's worth of social media posts. Or you can take that podcast episode and, get the transcript, clean it up, put it in a blog format, and now you have a blog. You can also take that podcast episode, and if you have a Facebook group, create discussion questions. There's so much you can do with a single podcast episode. And the best part is that it creates such a cohesiveness in your messaging. And that is what people need. You have people in your audience who they follow you on Instagram. They're on your email list. They're part of your Facebook group. So now you're able to hit them at those different points, on those different platforms, and they're getting the same message across those platforms. And so it's going to help fast track that nurturing process, especially if your messaging is clear and you are speaking to the heart of them, speaking to, what they desire, the transformation they want. And so you're going to fast track that nurturing process and see those higher conversions because they're getting the same clear messaging across all the platforms that they follow you on. So again, it simplifies that content creation process, but also simplifies the whole nurture to convert process. So some things to consider, again, as a mom and a business owner when it comes to, should you start a podcast for your business? You really want to look at your current season of life and what you have the capacity for. So it can feel overwhelming at times, especially if you have really little ones, or maybe, kind of similar to me and my husband's situation. For most of this time, we haven't really had family support. My mom, thankfully, is back in California, so we have her support now on the weekends. But, maybe you don't have that family support. Maybe it's just you and your spouse, or maybe you're a single mom. So yes, be realistic with yourself and make sure that this is something you can actually take on, because podcasting is a time investment. Now, there are things that you can do to simplify it. And I'm going to talk about that in future episodes because I'm kind of doing like a little series here, not officially naming it a series, but it's like we're really focusing on podcast launching and starting a podcast this month. But anyways, really just being open and honest with yourself about what you can realistically commit to so that you're not one of those people who becomes a pod fade. And then the other thing that you want to be honest with yourself about and reflect on is, how are you currently doing with your content creation? So, are you struggling to stay consistent with creating content, whether that's for Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, your blog, YouTube, whatever avenue you've chosen to create content for your business? Are you being consistent with it? Do you enjoy how you're currently creating content? Do you have any form of evergreen content as part of your marketing strategy? Now, when we're first starting out in business, evergreen content is not something that is typically on our radar. We're just trying to get in the groove of things. We're trying to get clients. And so a lot of times we just focus on like Instagram or Facebook groups to quickly get clients, which it makes sense for that stage of business. But if you're a little bit further on, you've been in business a year or more, you have like a pretty good system going, then you really want to start thinking about incorporating evergreen content into your marketing strategy. And the reason why is that evergreen content is going to continue to work for you even when you're not showing up online. So just to kind of give you guys an example, earlier this year, I was like, I'm going to blog every week, a new blog once a week. That lasted like a month, but those blog posts that I put out back in January are still driving traffic to my website. So whether people are doing Google searches or they're coming across my Pinterest pins, it's still driving a significant amount of traffic to my website. And I haven't published another blog since January of this year. So that is how evergreen content can work in your favor. It can still drive people to your website, despite you not creating new content for it. So that's, vastly different compared to like Instagram and Facebook, where your content has a shelf life of 24 to 48 hours. So it's like really starting to think about that, starting to think about ways to kind of simplify things in your business, especially, as a busy mama. Our kids get sick and different things happen. The kids don't sleep through the night. You're exhausted. And so trying to, record something for Instagram or, put together a new post and whatnot, like even when you try to batch it, sometimes it's challenging. And so it's really nice to have that other aspect of evergreen content that is going to continue to work for you, even when, hey, maybe you need to take a week off from Instagram. So just really starting to think about that. Now, there are some things that you really want to make sure you have in place before you start a podcast. So you're asking yourself, should I start a podcast? But you're not sure if it's the right time for you. So a few things you want to consider. One, you really should have an established business with set offers that have yielded results for your clients. Now, when I say established business, I'm not saying you need to be a six-figure business owner. I'm not saying you need to have a full team. I'm not saying you need to be up there with like Amy Porterfield and Jenna Kutcher and all of those people. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have validated your offers. You've signed clients with these offers. You have social proof, testimonials from these clients saying, yes, this strategy worked for me. This offer did X, Y, and Z for me. So you know that these offers are good, they're needed, they're wanted, and they do what they claim to do. That is what you want to have in place. Because if you're using this podcast as part of your business, you need to be marketing those offers. If not, this podcast is just going to become another thing on your plate. You're just doing it to do it. Like, it's not driving people anywhere if you're not promoting your offers. Now, yes, you can use it to grow your email list, but if you're getting people over to your email list, you need to be selling to them. And again, you need to have those established offers to sell to them. So that is why this is like a big part of determining whether or not it's the right time for you to start a podcast. The next thing is that you are clear on your messaging. So I talked about this a little bit earlier about the importance of that clear messaging. So that way you can share it across platforms. But if your messaging isn't clear, and if that's not, seen through your podcast content, you're not going to convert your listeners into your paid offers and programs. So you want to make sure that the messaging you are, giving, like what you're saying in your content, is actually speaking to the heart of your listeners. It resonates with them. You're speaking to the transformation they desire. You're speaking to where they're currently at in their life and business, and really showing how you can elevate them. You can take them to that next level where they desire to be. If that's not coming through in your podcast content, then it's just falling on deaf ears, or you're just creating feel-good content. So you really want to make sure you have that messaging down. And you'll know that. Like, if you are signing people into your offers currently and you're getting that positive feedback and you're seeing your clients hit the results that you have said you're going to help them reach, then yes, your messaging is good, because you're calling in the right people who are the best fit for your offers, and you're seeing that transformation happen. So basically, the first two, they go together. So if you have those down, you're good. And then the next thing is that I highly recommend that you guest on a few podcasts before you start your own. And the reason why is that it's a different way of creating content. And so you want to make sure that you are familiar with how it works, that you're comfortable with being behind the microphone, that you actually enjoy creating content in this format. And so the only way you're going to know that is by guesting on other people's podcasts. And so you'll want to do that before you start your own, because if you find that you actually hate podcasting, and then you started this podcast, like, you wasted your time and your energy. So if you haven't been a guest on podcasts, I highly recommend go and do that. Go try it out. Be a guest on one or two podcasts, get a feel for it. And if you enjoy it, then yeah, go ahead and add a podcast to your business. And then the last thing, which is, it's not an actual requirement, but it's something to consider, is that, like, you're ready to simplify your content creation. And I touched on this a bit earlier, because your podcast really can support you with simplifying that. Or, you want to cut back maybe on the amount of content you're creating for social media. Now, this isn't a requirement in that, like, there are people who absolutely love creating content for social media. And I love that for you if you're one of those people. And so your podcast can support you with that, in that, like, you can repurpose it and you can create a week's worth of social media content. So, and like I said, it's not a requirement, but it's something to consider, especially if you're one of those people who maybe you want to take a bit of a step back from creating content on social media, or maybe show up less, or maybe like me, you want to switch to the 9 grid and maybe just do Instagram stories. Whatever the case may be, your podcast can support you with that. So those are some of the things to consider when you are asking yourself, should I start a podcast for my business? So as a recap, you just want to make sure that you have an established business with set offers. Again, you don't need to be a 6-figure business owner. You don't need to have a full team. You don't need all of that. And then you also want to make sure you're clear on your messaging. You also want to make sure you have guested on podcasts before, just to make sure you're comfortable with creating content in this way. And then This one is optional, but if you're ready to simplify your content creation or possibly cut back on the amount of content you're creating for social media, then yeah, it's a great time for you to start a podcast. So I hope this episode really gives you something to think about, especially like as I said earlier, we're in Q4, we're coming up on 2024 very quickly. And so maybe one of your goals for 2024 is to start a podcast. So listen to this episode again, take time to reflect, and really make sure that starting a podcast is right for you in this current season of life. It makes sense for the stage of business you're in, and that it's something that you actually want to do. You don't have to start a podcast because everyone else is doing it. You're not missing out, especially if a podcast doesn't make sense for you in this current season of your life at this stage of business, or it's not something you actually want to do. It's not the type of way that you like to create content. So I hope this helps you and frees you up, especially if you are someone who's been on the fence about starting a podcast. And yeah, I would love to hear from you, especially if you are thinking about launching a podcast and maybe you have some more questions. So feel free to shoot me a DM over on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Mama Turned Mompreneur. All right, I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Mama, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. Whether you're a podcaster ready to create podcast content that attracts her dream clients, or a mama that's ready to stop the social media burnout and simplify her marketing through podcasting, I can support you. Head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/connect to submit an interest form so we can chat about how I can best support you. All right, Mama, I will talk to you again soon.